Welcome back to another episode of Hazy Headed. Today I'm going to talk about my theory on consciousness and how it relates to us in the world. I'm Evan Brandt, and this is my theory of consciousness. Consciousness is one of those things that are very interesting because when we look at it as a concept, it's pretty straightforward. It's the faculties our brain creates. But in religion and all sorts of other philosophical practices, there's a big unknown about it. And even people that are in science, there's a cross between what people consider supernatural and natural. And if you are big in the self-help space, you'll see neuroscientists and many other people talk about this term, the law of attraction. And then this is where it kind of gets into the idea that we can just believe our way into situations. And once you unlock this sort of hidden mechanism that is the subconscious, your life is so much better and all these things, which there are some truths to it. There's something in our brain that we can look at things and single them out. For example, if I say to myself, okay, I've got a 2016 HRV. Well, obviously I do. That's my car. I'm going to be able to see those things more. And that's kind of what the law of attraction is, stripping all of its woohoo, boohoo, is that what you see is what you've programmed yourself to see. And you obviously see things that stick out to you, like your car, people in your life, all these different things. But how does this relate to consciousness? Because the conscious, pretty much, there's in Freud, in his view on psychology, there's ID, ego, superego. But we're just going to talk about the conscious and unconscious. So the conscious is everything that we see. Our consciousness is our awareness of our consciousness. Everything we see, hear, taste, feel, that is programmed in the conscious. The subconscious is constantly taking things, and it communicates through repetition. So the more you see something, the more it's going to get registered in your subconscious. That's why logos are so big and all these things. That's why advertisers push so much to get registered in the subconscious. Well, there's this idea that many people believe that there is something supernatural to the subconscious and just consciousness in general. People will make the claims like, oh, your thoughts are always around you, but it's how you tune into them versus, we're just a bunch of chemicals lumped together. My theory is that we do have an access to a higher power. And I can see why people talk about the subconscious and the conscious and this that relates to this. Because when you look at the processes of all animals, we just have a step above everybody. I'm not going to turn this into a Joe Rogan podcast as much as I love his craft, but we're not going to talk about alien blood and all of this. But it makes things that are interesting because self-awareness is a concept, as far as we know, that it has to do with humans. We're the only ones that have it. And at the very least, so I don't get scientifically fact-checked, at the very least, we have that ability way more than all species to begin with. And it just makes me wonder a lot of things. Because when you look at the fabric of life, it all comes from consciousness. It all comes from the faculties of the ability we give ourselves. And once you really dive into that, and then you dive into what you're capable of, you'll see tremendous stories. I was just talking to this girl at the dog park about this guy who was in danger, and he lifted like a ton boulder off of him or something, and they explained scientifically how that works. The point is that the amount of faculties that we have, the just like almost abilities that we have, intuition is something that's so powerful that we don't even talk about. And obviously this stems from our conscious. The big question becomes, well, okay, how can we maximize that? Because I feel like there are a lot of people that live life in a very passive way. Intentional living is not just some cutesy term. It's important. I've been blessed or cursed, depending on what view you want to take, to experience both, to live a life that is so intentional that every second, including hardship, feels bearable. But then I've had the flip side where everything feels like it's being drained into this way of living that I do not care about. So to see both of those, and for that to have come from me, the idea of consciousness is way more fascinating to me, because it's almost like our experience is almost 100% dictated by us. And that's something that we overlook all the time. I've read Marcus Aurelius' Stoicism, and I think that is almost the reason why I love it so much. I did a whole Hazy Headed series on it, is because it really does lay the framework of understanding that this is all you. If you're a drug addict or you are just a hateful person, you can always find an excuse for it. But at the end of the day, it is you and nobody else. And that's kind of what consciousness is. I really think there's just a rich flow of energy, whether you want to call it God, consciousness, whatever. That's why the lines are blurred. Obviously, consciousness is our experience. But then, you go deeper into that, and sometimes you can be in a bad mood or something. But then, there's a little fortune cookie that changes your whole perception and how much our felt experience lives in this consciousness. And that kind of ties back to intuition. But I say all this to let me circle back. I say all this because when I was in that dark space, it felt like I still was tapped into this energy. It's almost like the consciousness, where we are going to talk about it from a woohoo angle for a second. Like, whoever blessed me with this experience, I think the more you look into this idea, I think there's a strong correlation between your spirit and your mental faculties. And, a lot of people that are very successful claim that we're very spiritual beings. And that's true. But then why do we have so much pain and hatred, even though we know that there's something way bigger than us? Every single person, atheist, doesn't matter. They can argue that it's real, but science just can't explain it yet. And that's fine. But when did we lose the magic and the mystery of, what we are and who, it doesn't just have to be a religious sense, but just like, what makes me want to be kind to someone? What in the morning when the dew, you can just smell it. A scent can bring you back to, a very different part in your life. And I just think that's so cool. And we don't really appreciate these little moments. And I think, the reason why spiritual practice kind of gets us in the present moment is because that's when you can really feel your consciousness. If you can't tell yet, I'm using consciousness as a very open-ended term that you could argue that I'm talking about your spirit, you're talking about something else. But yeah, I'm using this in an open way because I think we don't need to interpret it as much as we need to tap into it. Because like I said, the intentional living that I was lacking when I was drinking, partying, being hedonistic, just living in a very poor way in my life, I think what was so powerful for me was getting back to what I have inside me, which if you can silence your mind, you can really feel a powerful presence within you. And then it's so crazy to think about because this kind of branches into all sorts of other theories. But there's an idea that we are a unified consciousness, that we are just little dots and that the flow of consciousness is omnipresent. And then I've been researching Dolores Cannon, and she believes in reincarnation, and she believes that we are kind of all from one energy source, and that's hard to that's hard to put to the side, because you talk to people and they all have very similar experiences, near-death experiences, all these things that just feel so profound. And it just makes me wonder, if we are separate beings, why do we have so many common emotional experiences and all these different things? Some people have way easier lives than others, but we still go through grief and pain and jealousy and all these things that kind of you'd think would heal us and put us closer together because we can relate to each other. But that's not always the case. But yeah, my theory is that God is an omnipresent being, and that when he created the universe and he created us, he just split himself into all of us. And God is kind of one with nature. There's a famous scientist, I've watched a whole video on this, who challenged the status quo on creation and the Bible. And he said nature is God, and that we are all together on this journey, but we are a single essence. And that's so powerful, because that's kind of how I believe it. Even growing up Christian, it's so hard for me to submit to the idea God is just an overlooker of our life, and that he is the almighty commander and he runs this place like a well-oiled military machine. I just feel like we just are so much more than that. And I personally think, saying all this, and after all, this is my take on consciousness. That's the name of the video. I definitely think consciousness is a river, and that we as beings tap into it. And I think that kind of goes into our spirit. It ties in with the spirit. I think being able to control our mental faculties has something to do with it. And I think it does I think the brain creates this experience, but I think it is just a harmonious display of existence. And yeah, so that's kind of my theory on consciousness. Thank you all for listening. Tune in next week for another episode. We're going to get guests going. Please subscribe, watch my shorts on psychology, and thank you for your time and your continuous support.